The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as Megan O'Brien pushed the medication cart down the third-floor corridor of Mercy General, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible. She'd been at the hospital for 6 days. Nobody had learned her last name yet. Nobody asked. The scrubs fit loose around her frame. She'd lost weight during the last month before arriving in Raleigh, the kind of weight that came from not eating, from staring at something in your closet that you'd promised yourself you'd never look at again. A pair of worn combat boots with size 9 military issue stamped on the insole. Wrapped in a plastic grocery bag at the bottom of her locker. She tried not to think about them during shifts. Room 7 held Colonel Marcus Chen, an elderly veteran admitted 3 days ago with pneumonia that wasn't responding to the standard protocol. She'd been assigned his case, had watched his daughter Rebecca hold his hand during visiting hours, had seen the way his breathing came shallow and labored through the nights. He was a good man. Quiet. The kind of old soldier who didn't complain, who understood that suffering was just part of the work. When she entered his room at 10:38 p.m. to check his vitals and monitor, he was asleep, his chest rising and falling with effort. His oxygen sat at 91%. She made a note in the chart. Then she went to find Dr. Hargrove. He was in the physician's lounge on the 3rd floor, reading something on his tablet, a cup of coffee cooling on the table beside him. The room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a space where important people came to relax. Dr. Hargrove was 53, trim, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He'd been at Mercy General for 14 years. His name was in the hospital newsletter quarterly. He had hospital board members who golfed with him. When Megan entered, he looked up with the expression of someone who'd just been interrupted by a mosquito. Dr. Hargrove, I wanted to discuss the CT scan order for Colonel Chen in room 7. She kept her voice level, deferential, the way you spoke to authority when you were still new enough to understand the hierarchy. His last scan was Thursday. That's the 3rd one in 4 days. He set the tablet down slowly. Yes? His renal function is declining. The contrast dye burden is significant. We're looking at 18 millisieverts of radiation exposure on top of 2 previous scans. She pulled up the chart on her phone, showing him the progression. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. She had learned, years ago, how to deliver bad news without flinching. The pneumonia is bacterial. The antibiotics are just starting to work. Another CT seems premature. Hargrove stood. He was taller than her by 4 inches, and he used those 4 inches the way some men use suits, wearing them like a promise of authority. He looked at the chart, then at her, then back at the chart. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost conversational, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. Appreciate the input, he said. But I have 12 more years of medical training than you do. The scan is ordered. It's happening tomorrow at 0900. She didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. She was a nurse on day 6. She would learn, over the next 2 months, that questioning orders had a price. What she didn't know was that Dr. Hargrove had been running an insurance scheme for 8 years with Radiology Contractor Solutions Incorporated, a billing shell company owned by a man named Vincent Perez. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity: order tests that patients needed medically and tests they didn't, split the difference between the insurance companies and the contractor, pocket the margin. Nobody looked closely at individual orders. The patterns were buried in the noise of thousands of scans. Until someone started reading charts. Until someone started questioning why an elderly patient needed 4 imaging studies in a week. Megan O'Brien, on her 6th day at Mercy General, had just become the person who could break everything. At 6:15 a.m., Hargrove called an all-staff meeting in the conference room. Megan arrived at 6:22, the last one to sit down. The table was full: 14 nurses, 3 residents, 2 attending physicians, a phlebotomist. The room smelled like coffee and the exhaustion of people who'd worked 12-hour nights. Hargrove stood at the front, casual, leaning against the table like this was just a friendly conversation. I wanted to talk about team dynamics, he said. About what it takes to be a team player in this department. Some of you know what I mean. Some of you are still learning. His eyes moved across the room and landed on her for exactly 1 second. New staff members sometimes come in with a lot of energy, a lot of ideas about how things should be done. That's great. That's enthusiasm. But there's a reason we do things the way we do them. There's a reason there's a chain of command. There's a reason I'm the attending physician and everyone else is not. In my experience, nurses who succeed here are nurses who understand that they work with us, not for themselves. He paused. Looked around the room. Made eye contact with everyone except her this time. I'm here to help you all succeed. I want this to be the best department in Raleigh. But I need everyone pulling in the same direction. If you're a team player, if you understand the hierarchy, if you trust that I know what I'm doing, then this is a great place to work. And if you don't understand that, well, there are a lot of other hospitals in North Carolina. Okay. Good meeting. Everyone back to work. He left. The room stayed silent for 3 seconds. Then conversation started again, but they were quieter, more guarded. Rebecca Gutierrez, the senior charge nurse, was the first to stand. She caught Megan's eye for a moment, and in that moment was something like apology, which meant she already knew what was coming and was choosing not to fight it. Megan gathered her tablet and her badge and her sense that everything had just shifted underneath her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. By lunchtime, she'd understood. She went to the break room at 1:15 p.m., the usual time, and 3 nurses who were sitting at the table, Rebecca, Sarah, and someone new named Diane, gathered their food and their phones and their dignity and left. They didn't make a show of it. They just stood up and went to eat somewhere else. She sat alone at the table, ate a sandwich she'd brought from home, and listened to the hum of the refrigerator. By day 8, nobody sat near her. By day 12, the conversations in the hallway paused when she approached. She didn't understand yet that this was intentional. That Hargrove had spent 30 minutes in individual conversations with each nurse on his service, saying things like, "Look, I like Megan, I do, but you've got to understand that she's still finding her rhythm here, and I'm not saying anything formal, but the nurses I trust most are the ones who understand that we're a close-knit team, and most powerfully, the staff who get assigned to my best patients are the staff who get my recommendations for advancement." Just something to think about. He'd mentioned the vacancy in the ICU program. He'd mentioned that he was on the credentialing committee. He'd mentioned, by implication, that loyalty had rewards and questioning had costs. But Megan was still too new to read the dynamics. She just felt the cold. She just felt the silence. She just went home after her shifts, looked at the pair of wrap boots in her locker. She'd kept them there, hadn't taken them home, because going home meant thinking about why she'd kept them, and told herself that she was a nurse. That was what she was now. Not anything else. Not anyone else. Just a nurse with a job to do. On day 13, a trauma code came through at 2:33 p.m. The intercom crackled with urgency, trauma alert, Bay 1, 5 minutes, and the department moved from routine to crisis in the space of 4 heartbeats. Megan was assigned to triage, pulling histories, and prepping the room when the ambulance arrived. A 42-year-old male, construction accident, crush injury to the right leg, heavy bleeding, blood pressure dropping. As they moved him onto the trauma bed, Megan saw something in the senior resident's face, a hesitation, a moment of freezing while the chaos moved around him. She didn't think. Her hands moved on their own. She grabbed the 14-gauge angiocath from the trauma tray, prepped the groin area, and hit the femoral artery on the first try. 2 liters of O-negative were running before Hargrove even arrived in the bay. By the time he got there, her hands had already moved into the next sequence, pressure dressing, elevation, positioning, with the kind of fluid precision that made it look easy. The patient's blood pressure had stabilized. The bleeding was controlled. The senior resident, whose name was Dr. Patel, watched her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe. Or recognition. Or something that looked like seeing her for the first time. After the patient was stabilized and transferred to OR, Patel found her in the hallway. She was restocking the trauma cart, moving with her usual quiet efficiency when he appeared beside her. "That was textbook femoral access," he said. His voice carried something like awe. "I've seen attending physicians take longer to thread that line." She kept her hands moving, kept her voice level and deferential the way she'd trained herself to speak. "Just practice. You'll get there." "Where did you practice before Mercy?" he asked. She didn't answer for 3 seconds. Then, emergency services. Different context. It was the most he'd gotten her to say since she'd arrived. He nodded, like he understood that there was a conversation happening underneath the words that neither of them was going to have. He walked away, and she went back to work, and that night she lay in her apartment listening to the sound of Raleigh traffic and didn't think about the boots in her locker because thinking about them meant acknowledging that some part of her, the part that moved like that during codes, the part that read trauma situations the way other people read room temperature, was still waiting for something. Still listening for orders that would never come again. The next morning, she opened her locker before her shift. The plastic bag was still there, untouched, at the bottom, underneath her civilian shoes and her extra socks. She could see the toe of the right boot, faded tan leather, size 9, worn from 2 deployment rotations through Tikrit where she'd been Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, not just a nurse, not just invisible. She closed the locker and didn't look at them again until the silence got louder. Until the isolation got deeper. Until someone who knew exactly who she was walked through the doors of Mercy General and made it impossible to hide anymore. But that wasn't going to happen for 6 more weeks. For now, she was just the quiet new nurse who asked questions and ate lunch alone and moved her hands like someone who'd held lives together in her past, even if no one in this hospital would ever know it. The morning round started like they always did at Mercy General, fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional grey, the smell of antiseptic underlaid with something darker, something like illness and old fear soaked into the walls. Megan pushed the med cart down the corridor, the wheels squeaking with each step, a rhythm she'd learned to move through without thinking. 6 weeks in. She'd stopped counting the days around week 3. Room 12 had a full house when she arrived. The Patterson family, daughter, son-in-law, 2 adult grandchildren, stood clustered around the bed like they were bracing for impact. The patient, Mrs. Patterson, 74 years old with stage 4 ovarian cancer, lay against pillows that had yellowed from too many hospital stays. Dr. Hargrove, the pharmacy flagged a dosage conflict between the pain order and her current cardiac medication, Megan said, keeping her voice level, clinical, the voice she used when she needed to be heard and not noticed. "I called pharmacy twice for clarification on your standing orders. The hold was released at." "Always someone else's fault," Hargrove said, cutting her off with a smile that was precisely calibrated to look patient and concerned, the kind of smile that made you question whether you'd actually heard what you thought you heard. "This is what happens when we hire people who can't handle pressure. Mrs. Patterson, I sincerely apologize. Your pain management should have been seamless." He turned to the family with his hands open. "See how reasonable I am, see how I protect you from incompetence," and Megan watched the daughter's expression shift from fear about her mother to something else. Something like anger. At Megan. The room went still. Not quiet. Still. Like the moment between lightning and thunder, when the air itself is holding its breath. Megan took one measured breath. She'd learned in interrogation training that breath was a weapon you controlled before it controlled you. She let a single tear escape, not from sadness, from the sheer pressure of restraint, and wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. "I've worked under men who led with fear before, Dr. Hargrove," she said quietly. "They all eventually ran out of people willing to follow." His jaw tightened. She saw it. The microscopic failure of his composure, the instant where his carefully calibrated superiority met something he couldn't calculate. It lasted less than a second. Then he turned back to the family and continued his rounds, his residents trailing behind him like they'd never witnessed anything at all. Megan finished checking the 4. Mrs. Patterson's daughter wouldn't look at her. 2 days later, Megan sat in the break room with the lunch she'd packed, turkey sandwich, apple, the kind of meal that took no time and required no conversation. The corner table where the day shift nurses congregated had 3 of them sitting there: Jennifer from the orthopedic unit, Marcus from trauma, and Casey from the ICU. They saw her the moment she sat down at the adjacent table. They exchanged glances. Not obvious glances. The kind of glances that had become the language of the department since the morning rounds, wordless, practiced, executed with the precision of people who'd learned to communicate disdain without speaking. They gathered their things. Plates scraped. Chairs pushed back with a deliberate slowness that felt like punctuation. They left without speaking. Megan ate her sandwich. The turkey tasted like nothing. She'd learned long ago that anxiety dulled the sensory world, flavors flattened, colors muted, the world became a series of gray diagrams her body moved through. It was a useful skill. It kept you functional. The next day, they did it again. And the day after that. By the end of the week, Megan had learned the rhythm. She timed her break to avoid the peak hours. She ate in the supply closet on Tuesday, in her car on Wednesday, at her desk while charting on Thursday. The break room had become a place that existed for everyone but her, the way a room can be full of noise and still be the loneliest place on earth. That Friday, Hargrove posted the write-up. It was on the unit board, laminated and pinned at eye level like a public notification. Quality Improvement Documentation Review, R.N. O'Brien. 3 incidents listed. Medication calculation errors on dates she knew with absolute certainty she'd never worked. Charting discrepancies in patient files. A notation about pattern of documentation inconsistencies requiring immediate corrective action. Megan stood in front of the board. Her hands didn't shake. She'd trained her hands not to shake. But something in her chest had learned to recognize the sound of doors closing. Staff members walked past her as she stood there. She watched their eyes slide past her name, then down to her face, then away. One nurse, Sarah, who'd smiled at her 3 weeks ago in the medication room, whispered something to another RN. They both looked at Megan. Megan heard the nickname that afternoon. The liability. It moved through the unit like a virus. The liability didn't know how to chart. The liability made mistakes. The liability was the reason patients got hurt. The liability shouldn't be here. Hargrove made sure she heard it. During a code blue in the ICU, with the patient's chest open on the table and the attending barking orders, Megan called out the medication dose, pushing 1 milligram Epi4 now. "Is that your calculation?" Hargrove asked loudly, not looking at her, his voice pitched for the entire trauma team. "Because if your math is as imprecise as your documentation, Mrs. Chen's cardiac status is about to take a very unfortunate turn." The code team froze for exactly 1/10 of a second. The dose was correct. Everyone in the room knew the dose was correct. Megan had run the calculation twice, checked it against the patient's weight, verified it with the pharmacy protocol posted in the unit manual. But doubt had been introduced. Doubt had a texture now. Doubt felt like standing in a room where everyone had learned to look past you. She said nothing. Her hands continued the infusion without tremor. The heart monitor's rhythm climbed from flat to organized. Sinus rhythm returned. The patient survived. Hargrove didn't apologize. He simply left the resuscitation bay and moved on to the next problem that needed solving. That night, Megan opened her locker. The boots were still there. Same spot. Bottom left corner, wrapped in a plastic bag that had yellowed with time. The leather was cracked like old photographs. The laces were frayed at the edges, discolored from something that might have been blood or might have been sweat or might have been rain from a province 6,000 miles away that she'd promised herself she'd never think about again. She stared at them for a long time. Not thinking. Just looking. The way you might look at something you'd buried in a grave and suddenly found yourself standing in front of. She closed the locker. The metal door swung shut and she caught her reflection in the dull surface, a woman in scrubs with tired eyes and hands that knew how to do things this hospital didn't ask of her. Megan walked out of the locker room. She made it as far as the corridor before she heard Hargrove on the phone, his office door half open. She didn't plan to stop. Her feet just stopped, the way a body sometimes does when it recognizes a threat. "Yes, I'm trying to confirm a reference for one of our nurses," Hargrove was saying, his voice smooth as oil. "Megan O'Brien." "Yes, concerns about professional judgment and stability. I'd appreciate your discretion, but we're exploring whether this placement has been a good fit." "Thank you, I'll wait for your call." He was building something. She understood this the way soldiers understand an approaching sound, before analysis, before conscious thought, pure recognition. He wasn't just humiliating her anymore. He was constructing something, brick by brick, call by call, fabricated document by fabricated document. He was making sure that when she left Mercy General, and he would make sure she left, there would be nowhere else to go. The hallway stretched in front of her like a corridor she'd already walked 1,000 times and would walk 1,000 times more. Fluorescent lights humming their endless song. The smell of bleach and hope and dying things. Megan stood very still in that hallway, hands at her sides, and understood that the real battle hadn't started yet. Everything so far had been reconnaissance. Hargrove was still learning who she was. He still thought she was just a nurse. The mistake he was making would cost him. But that understanding would take time to manifest. For now, there was only the weight of silence and the knowledge that tomorrow she would return to the unit, and the day after that and the day after that, and every shift would require her to become smaller, quieter, more invisible. Every shift would teach her colleagues that the cost of associating with her was higher than the reward. Every shift would add another brick to the foundation of her professional destruction. She walked back to her locker. She looked at the boots again. She closed the door without opening the bag. The assignment board outside room 7 had Megan's name crossed out in blue marker. Not erased. Crossed out with 3 deliberate slashes, like she'd been struck from a casualty roster. Colonel Marcus Chen's name remained in the room slot, but beneath it someone had written Nurse Patterson in handwriting Megan recognized immediately, the careful cursive of Dr. Hargrove's administrative assistant. The night shift had left the notification unsigned, undated, no explanation attached. Standard procedure demanded a verbal briefing, a transfer form, a conversation between nurses. This was something else entirely. Megan stood in front of the board for 14 seconds, reading it 3 times to make sure the letters didn't rearrange themselves into something different. They didn't. Room 7 was no longer hers. The man she'd been monitoring for 2 days, the elderly veteran with the methodical breathing pattern and the sharp eyes that reminded her of command staff, had been reassigned without notice. Without reason. Without her knowing why, until she saw the marker line through her name like a correction on a test she'd failed. She turned away from the board and moved through the corridor toward the supply station. Her hands felt precise, controlled. This was the texture of institutional power working like a system, not a person making a decision. It was cleaner that way, harder to argue with, impossible to confront. You couldn't dispute a crossed-out name. You could only accept the reassignment and move forward. That was the logic of it. That was how men like Hargrove maintained control without ever having to speak the word. Room 7's door was visible from where she stood, 43 feet down the west corridor. She could see the 4 stand, the monitors, the outline of an elderly man in the bed. Colonel Marcus Chen. David's commanding officer. The man who'd kept her son alive through the Cunha Valley deployment in 2019 and again through the Helmand operations 18 months later. David had mentioned Chen's name exactly 3 times in conversation since coming home, which meant David had thought about Chen roughly 800 times. That was how her son's mind worked. He said one thing and meant an entire ocean of gratitude beneath it. Chen had written her a letter once, right after David finished his final tour. The letter was still in a drawer at home, unopened, because opening it meant acknowledging what David had survived and what that meant about the world and what it demanded of people who loved him. The reassignment wasn't a coincidence. Megan understood this with the same clinical clarity she'd once used to assess patients in a field hospital in Tikrit. The pattern recognition came first, then the diagnosis. Hargrove had flagged her challenging his CT order on day 6. She'd responded with quiet dignity on day 7. By day 9, she was being systematically excluded from staff lunches and unit meetings. By day 15, she was receiving formal write-ups for documentation errors she didn't commit. And now, on day 23, she was being separated from a patient without explanation. The progression followed a logic. The logic of strategic elimination. Her clinical instinct told her something else. Hargrove knew something. Something bigger than a single CT scan. She didn't walk directly to room 7. That would be confrontational, would trigger an immediate response from whoever Hargrove had briefed on this reassignment. Instead, she moved toward the supply station, restocked her cart with fresh fur bags and dressing kits, and worked her way through the adjacent rooms, staying within sight lines of the nursing station. Her presence was routine, unremarkable. Just Megan preparing for the shift ahead. Just another nurse doing the work no one noticed or credited. That was the mask she wore now, the one that had replaced the face of Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien 17 years ago. The mask worked because it was convincing. Because people genuinely did not expect much from quiet women who moved efficiently and kept their eyes on their work. When she was approximately 16 feet from room 7's door, Dr. Hargrove stepped out from the doorway of room 6. His timing was precise. His position was blocking. He held a patient chart against his chest like a shield and smiled the kind of smile that didn't require the muscles around his eyes to participate. "Ms. O'Brien. I was hoping to catch you." His voice had the texture of a door closing, a soft click that meant the conversation was already over. He was just explaining the outcome. Megan stopped moving. Her cart stopped with her. "Dr. Hargrove. I see you noticed the assignment change." He glanced back toward the board, then returned his attention to her with the expression of a man doing something reasonable. "Departmental restructuring. Patterson has more experience with geriatric trauma recovery. Colonel Chen requires that specialized skill set." The lie was structured like a syllogism. It sounded logical if you didn't know that Nurse Patterson had been at Mercy General for 8 months and had precisely 0 experience with geriatric patients. It sounded reasonable if you didn't know that Chen had been progressing predictably and didn't require specialized intervention. It sounded professional if you didn't know that Hargrove was standing between her and the patient door while saying it. "I see." Megan kept her voice level, kept her posture still. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the muscle control required to stand in front of someone who was deliberately blocking her from a patient and not let that injustice break across her face like weather. "I wasn't notified of the change through proper channels. You're being notified now." He opened the patient chart, pretended to review something inside it, a performance gesture that meant he was done having a conversation and was now simply informing her of facts. "I'd like you to focus your attention on the other assignments in your rotation. They need your full attention. We can't have staff splitting focus between multiple patients simultaneously. Patient care suffers when nurses attempt to manage more than their appropriate load." The implication was surgical. He was accusing her of overextending, of being unfocused, of compromising patient safety, all dressed up as administrative concern. All of it constructed so she couldn't argue the accusation without sounding defensive. That was the architecture of institutional power. That was how someone like Hargrove built a case against you piece by piece, moment by moment, until everyone in the organization was nodding along, convinced the problem wasn't him but her. Convinced that she was the one not performing. Megan was quiet for 7 seconds. The silence stretched between them like something physical. Hargrove's jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't accustomed to silence from her. He was accustomed to quiet agreement, to deferential acceptance, to the kind of apologetic response that confirmed his version of events. "I understand," she said finally. Her voice had dropped slightly, become more measured, as if she were explaining something basic to someone who hadn't quite grasped it. "Colonel Chen's care will transition smoothly to Patterson. I'll ensure comprehensive handoff documentation." It wasn't submission. It was acknowledgement of a fact. She was being removed from Chen's care. That fact would not change because she objected to it. That fact would not change because it violated every principle of continuity in patient management or basic human respect. That fact simply was, and fighting it would only confirm everything Hargrove was implying about her judgment. So she would accept it. She would document it. She would move forward. And she would begin to understand what she'd actually threatened when she'd questioned that CT order on her first week. Hargrove nodded, satisfied with her response. He stepped back slightly, reclaiming the doorway, and Megan understood this gesture too. He was done with her? She was dismissed. She moved her cart forward and continued down the corridor, aware of his eyes following her back, aware that something had shifted in the architecture of this hospital, and she'd just watched another brick get placed in the wall that was being built between her and anything that mattered. The corridor stretched ahead of her, fluorescent and neutral and utterly indifferent to the reassignment that had just occurred. Megan moved through it the way she moved through most of her shifts, efficiently, without drawing attention, completing each task in sequence. She restocked the supply station. She updated vital signs in the digital charts. She reviewed medication orders for the 3 patients who remained in her rotation. And somewhere beneath this layer of competent nursing work, another part of her mind, the part that had been trained in a field hospital in Tikrit, trained to see patterns in chaos and recognize threats before they announced themselves, was assembling information into a coherent picture. The reassignment was personal, but it wasn't random. Hargrove had moved against her strategically, using the authority of his position and the machinery of hospital administration. But why Chen? Why remove her access to that specific patient? What was it about Colonel Marcus Chen's presence in room 7 that constituted a threat to Dr. Hargrove? She found herself in the break room during her assigned rest period, though she didn't remember choosing to go there. The room was empty. It was 2:27 a.m., that particular pocket of night when even the night shift was distributed across patient care and no one was sitting down. The fluorescent overheads hummed their constant mechanical frequency, a sound so omnipresent it became white noise, became the background radiation of institutional life. She sat at the single table and thought about Chen. Thought about what a colonel would know. Thought about what patterns an elderly veteran with decades of military service might recognize that a doctor running certain kinds of schemes would desperately want hidden. The next voice Megan heard wasn't in the break room. It came through her radio, a dispatcher's tone, flat, professional, urgent. Mercy General Emergency Services, we have an incoming transport. Adult male, approximately 250 pounds, presenting with acute respiratory distress and altered mental status. ETA 5 minutes. Megan stood without consciously deciding to stand. The message continued, outlining vitals that made no sense until they made perfect sense: blood pressure unstable, respiratory rate elevated, oxygen saturation declining. Something was very wrong with whoever was heading toward their trauma bay. And everything that happened next began with those 5 minutes. The night shift at Mercy General began like every other night, fluorescent hum, the rhythm of monitors, the soft percussion of keyboards. Megan was restocking the trauma bay supply cart when the shouting started. Not the usual ER noise. Something else. Something raw. The ambulance bay doors burst open like a gunshot. A man. 250 pounds at least. Military bearing even in his chaos, his movements jagged with pain. His right hand was trembling toward his waistband where a pistol sat like a promise of something terrible. His left arm hung useless, his breathing making that sound, that specific sucking sound that made every ER nurse freeze. The kind of sound that meant something was collapsing inside his chest. Pain medication, he was screaming, his voice cracking. I need pain medication now or I swear to God. Security bolted. 2 nurses scattered backward toward the medication room. A resident who'd been charting froze mid-keystroke, then moved like he was being hunted. The attending physician who'd been reviewing labs simply turned and walked into the back office. The trauma bay cleared like someone had pulled a fire alarm. People running, that specific panic shuffle of medical staff who've just seen a weapon and decided their paycheck wasn't worth it. Everyone ran. Megan didn't move. Not immediately. She stood at the supply cart, watching him. watching the way his neck veins were bulging, the way his shoulders were heaving, the way his eyes weren't focusing, they were rolling slightly, searching, desperate. Not angry. Desperate. There was a difference. Anger wanted to hurt someone. Desperation wanted to survive. She recognized the signs before she recognized anything else. The sucking chest wound wasn't the problem. The problem was what came after, the air accumulating in the pleural space, collapsing his lung, pushing his heart and trachea over like a fist shoving furniture aside. Tension pneumothorax. His body was suffocating itself from the inside out. She moved toward him. Not toward the door. Toward him. Jimmy. Her voice was low. Rhythmic. The cadence she'd learned in Tikrit, when the power failed and the generator broke and there were people bleeding out in the dark. Jimmy, look at me. His eyes snapped to hers. For a second, she saw the calculation in them, threat assessment. She was a woman. She was small. She was moving toward him instead of away. His hand twitched toward the weapon again, but his movements were uncoordinated, hypoxic, like he was moving through water. I'm going to help you breathe. She kept walking, slow, hands visible. I need you to sit down. Nice and slow. Nobody listens. His voice cracked. Everybody runs. Nobody sees me. I see you. She was 10 feet away now. The gun was still visible, but his hand had fallen away from it slightly, distracted by the agony of each breath. You served, didn't you? I can tell. You're hurting. I see you. 90 seconds. That's how long it took for him to lower himself onto a gurney. His hand finally fell away from the weapon. Security moved in from the side, careful, professional, and removed the gun with the precision of people who'd trained for exactly this moment. Megan was already pulling supplies. Betadine. Gloves. A 14-gauge catheter. Tension pneumothorax, she announced to the staff who were beginning to emerge from wherever they'd hidden. He needs decompression now or he arrests. A resident from Johns Hopkins, probably 28, probably never seen trauma outside of a simulation, stammered, "Wait for the doctor. The doctor isn't breathing." Megan was already palpating his ribs, feeling for the landmarks. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She prepped the site with betadine in quick, precise circles. Her hands were steady. The kind of steady that comes from having done this before. In the dark. In the rain. In a tent with artillery walking closer. She inserted the catheter. Not hesitating. Not second-guessing. There was a hiss. The sound of compressed air escaping. Like a tire going flat. Like a world exhaling. Jimmy's color changed immediately. His breathing eased. His eyes focused. By the time police arrived 4 minutes later, he was conscious, tears streaming down his face, saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," over and over. The trauma bay fell silent. The kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes they made the wrong choice. When everyone who ran understands that they watched a nurse do something they could never do. Megan stripped off her gloves. Her hands trembled now that the adrenaline was fading, the shaking coming not from fear but from the specific weight of what comes after. The responsibility of it. The loneliness of it. Then she saw Hargrove in the doorway. He was already on his phone. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. He was looking at her like she'd just signed something. Like she'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He said nothing. Just watched. Just recorded the moment in his mind the way a hunter records the location of prey. Within 48 hours, the letter arrived. It was printed on hospital letterhead. It was clinically precise. It cited her for practicing medicine without a license, referenced a pattern of overstepping scope of practice, and informed her that she was suspended pending review by an outside HR investigator. The letter was so legally airtight, so carefully worded, that she could see Hargrove's fingerprints all over it, the hand of someone who'd already called the hospital board president during his morning golf game, who'd activated his entire network like a spider sensing vibrations in its web. The investigation was already in motion. Megan read the letter at the kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The rain was hammering outside. The house was quiet in that specific way that means loneliness has settled in. And in front of her, sitting on the table like an accusation, were her boots. The worn combat boots. She'd pulled them from her locker that morning in some desperate moment of defiance, some part of her that was tired of running from who she'd been. She stared at them. 15 minutes later, David walked through the door. Home on leave. He'd texted her that morning, wanted to spend the afternoon together. He found her at that table, tears streaming down her face, the letter beside her, the boots in front of her like evidence. Mom. His voice was small. Broken. Why are you home? She couldn't answer. Not without telling him everything. Not without explaining that the person he thought she was had been alive for 5 years. Not without opening the box she'd sealed and buried and sworn never to touch again. He sat down across from her. He was still in his service uniform. His own boots were caked with dust from somewhere she wasn't allowed to ask about. The rain kept falling. The silence kept building. And somewhere in Mercy General, a man named Jimmy Vance was recovering in the ICU, his lung re-expanded, his breathing normal, his life measured in the minutes Megan had bought him. He would live. He would go home. He would never know that saving him had cost her everything. The morning after Jimmy Vance survived, the hospital chaplain sent a note. Dr. Hargrove never read it. He was already on the phone with Richard Pierce, the hospital board president, who was mid-swing at Longleaf Pines Golf Club when his cell buzzed. Hargrove's voice carried the precision of a man protecting something valuable. We have a significant scope of practice violation that needs immediate attention. A nurse performed an emergency procedure without physician authorization. Needle decompression. Textbook practicing medicine without a license. Pierce lowered his putter. The message took root immediately, planted in the soil of institutional liability. By that same afternoon, Hargrove had contacted 3 of Megan's previous employers with carefully worded questions. I'm just trying to understand some patterns we're seeing. Has she ever had stability issues? Any concerns about overstepping professional boundaries? The questions were surgical. He didn't accuse. He insinuated. He let silence do the work. That evening, he walked into the HR office and closed the door. The outside investigator, a woman named Cynthia Wade who specialized in healthcare compliance, was already there, tablet in hand. Hargrove handed her a file thick with fabricated documentation. She's been forging entries in patient charts, he said quietly. Covering her tracks. I have examples here, here, and here. Wade's eyes narrowed. She was good at her job, but she wasn't suspicious of a senior physician. She was supposed to investigate, and he'd just handed her a narrative that felt like evidence. The hospital system moved like a predator that smells blood. By 48 hours later, the official letter arrived at Megan's apartment, cream-colored paper with the hospital seal embossed in the corner, the words arranged with corporate precision, effective immediately. You are suspended pending investigation of violations of the Nursing Practice Act, specifically performing invasive medical procedures beyond your licensed scope of practice. Your access to the hospital is revoked. The letter cited the needle decompression. It described her actions as reckless, dangerous, potentially criminal. It did not mention that she'd saved a man's life. It did not mention that every trauma surgeon in America would have commended what she'd done. It simply said, stopped. Investigation. Terminated pending review. Megan held the letter in her kitchen at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Rain hammered the windows like artillery fire. She'd already called David's unit commander and asked him to approve emergency leave. She didn't explain why. The combat boots sat on the kitchen table in front of her, the leather scarred and creased from 12 years of weight, the laces still frayed from the last time she'd tied them in Tikrit, 4,000 miles and 2 decades away from anyone who might have recognized what they meant. She'd kept them at the bottom of her locker for so long that their existence had become almost archaeological, evidence of someone else's life, someone else's choices, someone else's war. She was still staring at them when the front door opened. David stood in the doorway, his uniform hanging on him like borrowed skin, fresh off a 6-hour drive from Fort Bragg. He saw his mother sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded on a printed letter, saw the boots, saw everything. His voice came out small, the way children sound when they're learning that the world isn't what they thought it was. "Mom, why are you home?" Megan couldn't answer. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She looked at her son and realized in that moment that she'd spent 18 years trying to protect him from the truth, and it had made him into someone who couldn't recognize his own mother when she finally stopped hiding. 3 weeks later, the hospital called with news of an incoming emergency. A construction accident on the east side of Raleigh. 1 patient, critical, ETA for minutes. Megan wasn't supposed to answer the call. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the hospital. But she was already on her way. She'd been on her way every single shift for 3 weeks, sitting in her car in the parking lot, listening to the trauma frequencies on an old scanner David had dug out of a closet, unable to stay away from the only place she'd ever felt like herself. The gurney came through the trauma bay doors at 2:19 p.m., and the patient was a man in his mid-50s, dark skin ash-colored from blood loss, breath coming in short gasps. His left leg was wrapped in a tourniquet fashioned from a work belt. The resident began barking orders. The attending physician, not Hargrove, thank God, was marshalling the team. And then the patient's eyes opened. He focused on Megan. His hand shook as he lifted it, pointing with the precision of a man who'd spent his whole life remembering one specific moment. "You," he whispered in accented English, each word a small miracle. "You? Tikrit, you saved my brother." The room went so quiet you could hear the 4-pump ticking its mechanical rhythm. Megan's hands froze above the 4 kit she'd been about to open. The staff turned to stare at her, then at each other, confused. One of them whispered something. The attending physician looked at Hargrove's replacement, then back at Megan. But Megan was already moving, her hands on muscle memory that no suspension letter could erase, pulling the tourniquet release with the practiced motion of someone who'd done this 1,000 times under fire. The patient's eyes closed in relief. "Khalid," he gasped. "My brother is Khalid. You saved him. We never knew your name." Megan said nothing. She worked. Her movements were poetry, every motion deliberate and clean, her voice dropping into a register that made the entire room listen like soldiers waiting for orders. "Type and cross. 2 unit stat. Get me a vascular surgeon. He's got an arterial bleed, likely femoral. We need imaging." The words came without permission, without credentials, and nobody challenged her because she sounded like someone who had saved lives in places they'd never have to imagine. David appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, still in his dress uniform because he'd come directly from a homecoming formation. He took in the scene, his mother running a trauma code like she owned the room, calling procedures and staff movements with authority that seemed to come from bone-deep memory. She glanced up from the ultrasound machine. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. David's voice was barely a whisper, the way a soldier sounds when they recognize rank from someone they didn't know had earned it. "Senior Chief." Everything stopped. Not the monitors kept their rhythm, steady and unforgiving. But the human motion in the room seemed to pause, as if everyone had suddenly realized they'd been making a terrible mistake about who they were working with. Megan's hands trembled reading Khalid's file, the X-rays showing blast fragmentation from an IED that had gone off in his neighborhood 8 years ago, wounds she'd treated in a field hospital in the Jolan district while soldiers outside held the perimeter. Her name wasn't in any of the records. She'd been told to forget it ever happened. She'd tried. For 18 years, she'd tried. The trauma code continued. The vascular surgeon arrived. They got Khalid stabilized and prepped for surgery. And when he was wheeled out, he looked back at Megan one more time and nodded the way soldiers nod at people who've bled beside them. Then the ER doors burst open and a man in civilian clothes walked in like he owned the place, moving with the fluid precision of apex predators who'd spent their lives in places where hesitation meant death. His left eye had a scar that ran from temple to jawline. His badge identified him as Captain James Halloway, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, retired. He walked straight to Megan and didn't salute, because that wasn't the kind of unit they'd been in, but his hand went to his chest in the old way. "Senior Chief," he said, and then he turned to address the room, his voice carrying the weight of authority that can't be questioned because it's been earned in places civilians can't imagine. O'Brien earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. She ran trauma operations in the hottest zone in the province. That needle decompression 3 weeks ago? By the Geneva Convention and every tactical manual, that's a combat medic's skill. She's a trained trauma surgeon in everything but the paperwork. He looked at the attending physician. "You just got schooled by a legend. Say thank you." Nobody said anything. Because that's when the FBI agents walked through the doors. 2 of them, badges catching the fluorescent light like warnings. The lead agent, a woman in a dark suit with the kind of eyes that had been trained to see through lies, approached Dr. Hargrove, who'd somehow allowed himself to be present in a room where his entire world was about to collapse. "Dr. Hargrove," she said, and there was no question in her voice. "We need you to come with us." Hargrove's face went pale, then red, then a color that suggested his entire circulatory system was staging a rebellion. "This is absurd." "I don't know what you think," the agent continued as if he hadn't spoken. "We've been investigating insurance fraud at Mercy General for 3 months. Your arrangement with Radiology Associates involved kickbacks on unnecessary scans. $17,000 paid to a shell account in your name." She held up a file. "We also discovered your recent attempts to forge personnel records for Nurse Megan O'Brien. Fabricated disciplinary reviews. Falsified performance documentation designed to justify wrongful termination. Here's the interesting part. Someone sent us an anonymous tip 3 weeks ago that led us to examine your activities more closely." Hargrove started to speak. His voice cracked. "This is all very interesting, but it doesn't change the fact that Nurse O'Brien violated." The agent cut him off with a look that could have stopped a charging vehicle. "Step back, Dr. Hargrove." She nodded to her partner. Cuffs clicked into place. Cold steel against wrists that had never worn anything heavier than a $2,000 watch. Hargrove was sputtering now, trying to maintain some kind of dignity, but his words were coming apart. "You don't understand, she was going to ruin everything." She noticed the patterns. The agent finished the sentence for him. "Yes. She's a very good nurse. That was your problem." They walked him through the hallway. Past the unit board where he'd posted Megan's public humiliation. Past the break room where she'd eaten alone. Past room 7 where Colonel Chen watched from his doorway, his oxygen tubing hanging like medals. Staff members parted silently, like a sea remembering its shape before it was disturbed. Someone pulled out a phone and filmed. Hargrove's image, handcuffed, disheveled, the man who'd seemed so powerful, would be on local news by evening. His medical license would be revoked within 6 months. 18 months later, someone spotted him selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a Harris Teeter in Durham, his blazer threadbare, his smile practiced and hollow, making cold calls to people who hung up the moment they heard his voice. But that was later. In this moment, Megan stood in the trauma bay surrounded by staff who were finally seeing her clearly. David stepped forward and hugged his mother, and she didn't push him away. Captain Halloway shook her hand and said quietly, "Welcome home, Senior Chief." Khalid would recover fully. Colonel Chen would make a complete healing. And Megan O'Brien, the woman who'd spent 18 years running from who she was, stood at the center of Mercy General with her combat boots waiting in her locker and her future finally beginning. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and for the first time in 2 decades, she wasn't hiding. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why quiet people are often the most dangerous, why heroism doesn't announce itself, why those who've seen the worst are sometimes the ones who give the most, Please subscribe and like this video. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story? Because your story matters. And the world needs to hear it.